My name is General Thomas Garrett, and I commanded classified military operations for the United States Air Force for 32 years before what I witnessed at Area 51 fundamentally changed everything I believed about existence, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. I was a man of logic and discipline, trained to assess threats rationally, to make decisions based on evidence and tactical analysis rather than emotion or faith. I grew up in a military family where religion was something other people did on Sundays while we focused on duty and country. I considered myself agnostic at best, perhaps atheist if pressed, someone who needed empirical proof before accepting anything as true. The concept of God seemed like wishful thinking, a psychological crutch for those who couldn't handle the cold randomness of the universe. That perspective lasted until I descended to level 7 beneath the Nevada desert and encountered something that shattered every materialist assumption I had built my worldview upon. Area 51 exists despite decades of official denial that became almost comical to those of us with clearance. What the public doesn't understand is that Area 51 isn't one facility, but a massive, interconnected complex of underground installations descending 37 levels beneath the surface, each level containing progressively more classified projects that fewer and fewer personnel even know exist. The upper levels deal with conventional classified work, advanced aircraft development, recovered foreign technology, the kind of mundane secrets every major military power guards. The middle levels, around 3 through 6, contain the exotic technology that feeds conspiracy theories, recovered craft of unknown origin, materials that defy our current understanding of physics, biological specimens that don't match any known terrestrial life. These levels are impressive and certainly world-changing if their contents were ever made public, but they're ultimately explainable within existing scientific frameworks, just further along the technological curve than public knowledge has reached. Level 7 was different in ways that still make my hands shake when I think about it too deeply. I received Level 7 clearance in 2009 after 27 years of impeccable service and psychological evaluations that apparently convinced someone I could handle whatever was down there without losing my sanity completely. The security protocols to access Level 7 were excessive even by our standards, requiring biometric verification of 17 different physical markers, a fresh psychological evaluation every single time you descended, and acceptance that you were essentially signing away any constitutional rights for the rest of your natural life. The elevator ride down took 26 minutes, descending through solid rock, while your ears popped constantly from pressure changes, and the temperature dropped to almost freezing despite climate control systems. When the doors finally opened, you stepped into a space that felt wrong in ways your subconscious registered before your conscious mind could articulate. The air was different, heavier somehow, and there was a persistent low-frequency hum that you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears.
Level 7 was architecturally unlike the modern construction of the levels above it. The walls were smooth, but not in any way that suggested human construction methods, more like they had been formed from liquid that somehow solidified into rock. The lighting came from sources embedded within the walls themselves, not fixtures, but the material itself emitting a pale luminescence that made everything look slightly unreal. There were no right angles, no straight lines, everything curved and flowing in ways that were somehow geometric yet organic simultaneously. The few scientists and military personnel with Level 7 access spoke in hushed tones, if they spoke at all, and most developed a haunted look in their eyes after extended shifts down there. I initially assumed this was due to the isolation and sensory deprivation of being so far underground, but I would learn the real reason soon enough. The briefing I received on my first day came from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a quantum physicist who looked far older than her 43 years, with gray hair and an expression of someone carrying knowledge that weighed on her soul. She explained that Level 7 hadn't been built by humans, at least not by any human civilization we have historical record of. It had been discovered in 1971 during deep drilling operations for a classified weapons test, when equipment broke through into an existing cavity that geological surveys insisted couldn't possibly be there. The initial exploration team found a chamber system extending over 3 square miles, all of it carved from solid bedrock using methods we still can't replicate or even understand. The chambers were empty of any artifacts, any furniture, any indication of who built them or what they were used for. Just vast spaces with those strange glowing walls and that persistent vibrational hum that seemed to resonate at a frequency that affected human consciousness in ways we couldn't measure but definitely could feel. The military had been studying Level 7 for 38 years by the time I got clearance, and in all that time they had made almost no progress in understanding its purpose or origin. Carbon dating of the rock surfaces suggested the chambers were at least 40,000 years old, possibly much older, but the construction methods suggested technology far beyond anything humans possessed even today. There were no power sources we could identify, yet the walls continued glowing with that pale light decade after decade. There were no ventilation systems we could detect, yet the air remained breathable and stable. Electromagnetic readings were chaotic, showing patterns that violated known physics, and sensitive individuals reported experiencing strange cognitive effects, vivid dreams, moments of clarity or understanding that faded when they left the facility. Dr. Morrison explained that the prevailing theory was that Level 7 had been some kind of temple or ceremonial site for an unknown prehistoric civilization that possessed technology we couldn't comprehend, though she personally found that explanation inadequate for reasons she would show me. She took me to the central chamber, the largest space in the entire complex, roughly the size of a football stadium, with a ceiling that soared 40 feet above us. In the exact center of this chamber was what could only be described as an altar, though calling it that felt simultaneously inadequate and strangely accurate. It was a raised platform made of the same material as everything else, perfectly circular, about 15 feet in diameter, and suspended 3 feet above this platform, held in place by no visible means, was an object that my brain struggled to process correctly. At first glance, it appeared to be a sphere of light, brilliant white and almost painful to look at directly. But the longer you observed it, the more you realized it wasn't a sphere at all, or it was many spheres existing simultaneously, or it was shifting between dimensional states too quickly for human perception to track. The scientists called it the artifact, the simplest name for something that defied all attempts at more specific classification.
Dr. Morrison explained that the artifact had been here when they first discovered Level 7, hovering exactly where it was now, unchanged in 38 years of observation. They had tried everything to study it, every scientific instrument and analysis technique available to modern physics. Electromagnetic scanners showed it was generating energy, but couldn't determine the source. Particle detectors showed it was simultaneously matter and energy, and something else entirely. Gravitational measurements around it made no sense, suggesting it was far more massive than its size indicated, yet also somehow weighing nothing. But the most disturbing discovery was what happened to living things that got too close to it. Plants placed within 10 feet of the artifact grew at accelerated rates, blooming and withering in hours rather than weeks. Animals showed signs of heightened awareness and intelligence, rats solving complex mazes they had never encountered, dogs appearing to understand human speech they shouldn't be able to comprehend. And humans who spent extended time near the artifact reported experiences that ranged from profound spiritual awakening to complete psychological breakdown. I was skeptical of all this, naturally.
It sounded like New Age mysticism dressed up in scientific terminology, the kind of thing that should be investigated by theologians, not military commanders. But then Dr. Morrison showed me the footage from what they called the incident, recorded 7 months before my arrival. A theoretical physicist named Dr. James Chen had been studying the artifact for 3 years, longer and more intensely than anyone before him. He had developed an obsession with it, spending 18-hour shifts just sitting in the central chamber, staring at the phenomenon, taking notes that became progressively less coherent as weeks passed. His colleagues grew concerned, but his security clearance meant they couldn't remove him without his consent or a direct order from above. Then one night, working alone in the chamber as he often did, something happened that the security cameras captured, but no one could adequately explain. The footage showed Dr. Chen standing on the altar platform directly beneath the artifact, which he had been warned repeatedly never to do. As he stood there, the artifact's light intensified dramatically, brightening until the cameras automatically adjusted exposure to compensate. Dr. Chen's body went rigid, his arms spreading wide in a posture that looked almost crucifixion-like. And then he began to speak, but not in his own voice. The audio picked up multiple voices emanating from him simultaneously, speaking in languages that linguistic analysis identified as Ancient Sumerian, Sanskrit, Biblical Hebrew, and several others that couldn't be identified at all. The security team rushed to the chamber, but when they tried to approach, they encountered what they described as an invisible wall of force that prevented them from getting within 30 feet of the altar. Dr. Chen continued speaking in those overlapping voices for 6 minutes and 17 seconds before the artifact's light suddenly dimmed back to normal levels and he collapsed unconscious on the platform. When Dr. Chen regained consciousness 3 days later in the medical facility, he was fundamentally changed. He could now speak and write fluently in 17 languages he had never studied, including extinct languages no living human should be able to speak. He possessed detailed knowledge of historical events and scientific principles that he had no prior education in. Most disturbingly, he claimed to have experienced what he called total knowledge, a brief moment where he understood everything, the entire structure of reality, the nature of consciousness, the origin and purpose of existence itself. He said the experience was like being connected to the mind of God, or what humans throughout history had conceptualized as God, though he insisted that term was inadequate for what he had actually encountered. The military kept him in psychiatric observation for months, evaluating whether he had suffered some kind of psychotic break or if his claims had any validity. He never wavered in his testimony, never showed signs of delusion or fabrication, just an absolute certainty about what he had experienced that was either genuine mystical revelation or the most convincing psychotic episode in medical history.
The military solution to the Dr. Chen situation was typical. Classify everything even more heavily and restrict access to the central chamber except for essential research purposes. But I could see in Dr. Morrison's eyes that she believed him, that she thought he had genuinely experienced something profound and real, rather than suffering a mental breakdown. She had interviewed him extensively, recorded hundreds of hours of testimony, and become convinced that the artifact wasn't just advanced technology, but something else entirely, something that interfaced with consciousness in ways we didn't have frameworks to understand. She believed Level 7 had been built specifically to house the artifact, that whoever constructed those chambers 40,000 years ago had been trying to contain or protect or perhaps worship this phenomenon that existed at the intersection of matter and consciousness and something beyond both. My role at Level 7 was operational command, overseeing security protocols and managing the research teams to ensure nothing dangerous emerged from their studies. It was supposed to be administrative, keeping me safely distant from the actual phenomenon while ensuring proper procedures were followed. But 3 months into my assignment, Dr. Morrison requested that I personally experience proximity to the artifact, arguing that I couldn't properly assess security risks without understanding what personnel were actually encountering down there. I was hesitant, aware of what had happened to Dr. Chen, but ultimately my ego and curiosity won out. I agreed to a supervised approach to the altar platform, with full medical monitoring and security teams ready to extract me if anything went wrong. It was simultaneously the best and worst decision of my military career. Approaching the artifact was unlike anything I had experienced in 30 years of military service across multiple combat zones and high-stress situations. With each step closer, the vibrational hum I had been feeling as background sensation since arriving at level 7 intensified, resonating through my entire body in waves that felt almost like music, though no sound was audible. The light from the artifact seemed to reach into my mind, not harsh or painful, but penetrating, like it was reading every thought and memory I had ever had. By the time I reached the platform's edge, 10 feet from the hovering phenomenon, I was weeping without knowing why, overcome by emotions I couldn't identify or explain. I felt profound grief for every violent thing I had ever done or ordered done in service to my country. I felt overwhelming love for people I had lost touch with decades ago. I felt connected to every living thing in the universe in a way that made the boundaries of my individual self seem arbitrary and meaningless. Dr. Morrison's voice crackled through my earpiece, asking if I was okay, if I wanted to retreat. But I couldn't move, couldn't respond, couldn't do anything except stand there, experiencing what I can only describe as the presence of infinite consciousness. It wasn't like being in the presence of a thing, or even a being in any conventional sense. It was like becoming aware that consciousness itself was fundamental to reality, that matter and energy were just expressions of a universal mind that existed before the universe and would continue after its heat death. I understood, with a certainty that bypassed rational thought entirely, that what humans called God wasn't a supernatural entity separate from creation, but was the conscious awareness underlying all existence. The artifact wasn't God exactly, but it was a doorway or interface to that fundamental consciousness, a point where the veil between material reality and the ground of being became thin enough for limited human minds to catch glimpses of the infinite. I don't know how long I stood there, seconds or hours, time losing all meaning in that state. Eventually, I felt hands on my shoulders, security personnel pulling me back from the platform, leading me away from the artifact's presence. As the distance increased, the overwhelming sensations faded, leaving me feeling hollow and bereft, like I had been connected to something infinitely vast and beautiful and was now cut off from it again. I spent 3 days in medical observation, undergoing the same battery of tests they had given Dr. Chen, while doctors evaluated whether I had suffered brain damage or psychological trauma. But I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. I felt like I had been given a gift, a glimpse behind the curtain of material reality to see the deeper truth that mystics and saints throughout history had tried to describe with inadequate human language. The experience changed me fundamentally in ways that took months to fully process and understand. I started reading religious and philosophical texts from every tradition, recognizing in their descriptions of enlightenment and mystical union with the divine the same experience I had touched at level 7. The language differed, Christianity speaking of the Holy Spirit, Buddhism describing emptiness or Buddha nature, Hinduism teaching about Brahman, Sufism discussing fana or annihilation of the self, but they were all attempting to convey the same reality I had briefly perceived. Consciousness wasn't something that emerged from matter, from complex neural computations in biological brains. Consciousness was fundamental, the ground from which matter itself emerged, and individual human consciousness was like waves on an infinite ocean, appearing separate, but ultimately made of the same substance as the whole. I began attending Catholic Mass for the first time since childhood, finding comfort in ritual and community that acknowledged dimensions of reality beyond the material. Not because I suddenly believed in all Christian doctrine literally, but because I recognized that religious practice was humanity's attempt to maintain connection with what I had experienced at level 7. Prayer, meditation, contemplation, these weren't primitive superstitions, but technologies for accessing states of consciousness that revealed deeper truths about existence. The artifact had shown me that science and spirituality weren't opposed, but were approaching the same reality from different directions, and that both were necessary for anything approaching complete understanding. I had been wrong for decades about the nature of reality, dismissing spiritual and religious experience as delusion, when it was actually perceiving truths that materialist science couldn't access because it deliberately excluded consciousness from its frameworks. My colleagues at level 7 noticed the change in me, the way I spoke differently about the artifact and what it represented. Some were concerned that I had suffered the same fate as Dr. Chen, that my encounter had damaged something in my mind that made me unreliable for command. Others, particularly those who had spent extended time near the artifact themselves, understood what I was trying to express, nodding with recognition when I attempted to describe the indescribable. Dr. Morrison was especially supportive, confiding that she had undergone a similar transformation years earlier and had been waiting for someone in military command to have the experience so that perhaps they could shift how the project was approached. The current protocols treated the artifact as a potential weapon or technology to be studied and controlled. But what if it was actually something sacred, a gift or test left by a consciousness far beyond human comprehension, meant to help us evolve beyond purely material existence?
We began documenting cases of similar experiences throughout military and scientific personnel who had worked at level 7 over the decades. Roughly 40% of long-term staff reported some form of transformative spiritual experience, ranging from mild to overwhelming. Many left military or scientific careers entirely, pursuing religious vocations or philosophical studies, feeling that their previous work was missing what mattered most about existence. Some developed apparent psychic abilities, precognition or telepathy, or healing capabilities that defied rational explanation but were documented by multiple witnesses. A few suffered complete psychological breaks, unable to reconcile their experience with their previous worldview, ending up in psychiatric facilities where they were medicated into stability but lost whatever insight they had gained. The artifact was clearly affecting human consciousness in profound ways, but whether this was beneficial or harmful depended entirely on the individual's capacity to integrate the experience into their understanding of reality. The most disturbing pattern we discovered was historical. Through declassified documents and archaeological research that Dr. Morrison had been conducting, we found evidence that sites similar to Level 7 existed at least a dozen other locations around the world. Caves in Tibet that Buddhist monks had considered sacred for thousands of years showed the same architectural anomalies and that strange glowing stone material. Underground chambers beneath Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a structure that predates known civilization, contained geometric patterns identical to those at Level 7. A recently discovered cavity beneath the Antarctic ice matched the electromagnetic signature we detected around the artifact. All of these sites were either under military control or in locations so remote that public access was essentially impossible. And at each site where exploration was possible, there were local legends of encounters with divine presence, mystical experiences, communications with what various cultures interpreted as gods or angels or enlightened beings. The implication was staggering. Level 7 wasn't unique. It was part of a global network of sites, possibly dozens or hundreds of them, all containing the same or similar phenomena to the artifact we had found. These sites had been sacred to humans throughout our history, the birthplaces of religious traditions and mystical teachings, the locations where prophets and shamans and saints had their transformative encounters with what they perceived as divine reality. Moses on Mount Sinai, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Muhammad in the cave of Hira. Every major religious founder might have had their revelation at or near one of these locations, where the boundary between material and spiritual reality was particularly thin. The military implications were obvious. If these sites could transform consciousness and grant apparent supernatural abilities, they were strategic assets of unimaginable importance. But the spiritual implications were far more profound. What if human religious experience, all of it, across every culture and tradition, wasn't delusion or wishful thinking, but actual contact with a dimension of reality that our materialist science had spent centuries denying existed? I submitted a report to the Joint Chiefs recommending a fundamental shift in how we approached Level 7 and similar sites. Instead of treating them as potential weapons to be controlled, I argued we should recognize them as sacred spaces that deserved reverence and careful study by multidisciplinary teams, including not just scientists and military personnel, but also theologians, philosophers, and spiritual practitioners from various traditions. The artifact wasn't something to be contained or exploited. It was something to be learned from, a window into aspects of reality that our Western civilization had systematically ignored in our obsessive focus on material technology. My report was not well received. Several generals questioned whether my judgment had been compromised by my experience. A psychiatric review board was convened to evaluate my fitness for command, and ultimately I was informed that my services at Level 7 were no longer required, transferred to a conventional posting that felt like exile after experiencing something so profound.
But I couldn't let it go, couldn't return to seeing reality the way I had before. I continued researching on my own time, connecting with other military and scientific personnel who had undergone similar experiences at Level 7 or other classified sites. We formed an informal network, sharing information and insights, trying to piece together a comprehensive understanding of what these phenomena represented. The consensus among our group was that the artifacts, whatever they truly were, represented a form of consciousness far beyond human capability, possibly the consciousness underlying reality itself, possibly advanced intelligence from another dimension or timeline, possibly something we didn't have concepts to describe. They seemed to be deliberately interfacing with human consciousness, perhaps upgrading our ability to perceive reality beyond material dimensions, perhaps testing our species for some purpose we couldn't fathom, perhaps simply existing as natural phenomena that our religious impulse had interpreted as divine. I retired from military service in 2017 after 32 years of honorable service, but my real work was just beginning. I wrote a book about my experiences, heavily redacted to avoid violating security protocols, but conveying enough truth to reach people who were ready to hear it. I gave lectures at universities and religious institutions, speaking carefully about the intersection of science and spirituality, about consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent, about the possibility that ancient religious insights were actually accurate perceptions of reality that modern materialism had dismissed. Some people thought I was crazy, a decorated general who had suffered some kind of breakdown and developed delusions of mystical significance. But others recognized truth in what I was saying, people who had their own unexplainable experiences, who sensed there was more to existence than the purely physical universe science described. The question I'm asked most frequently is what I believe now, after everything I experienced and learned. Do I believe in God? The answer is complicated. I don't believe in God as a bearded man in the sky who cares about human affairs and answers prayers like a cosmic vending machine. But I do believe in a conscious, intelligent foundation to reality itself, a field of awareness that underlies and generates all existence, that individual consciousness connects to and ultimately returns to. I believe the artifact at level 7 is either a manifestation of that consciousness or a technology so advanced it might as well be divine, created by beings who understood dimensions of reality we're only beginning to glimpse. I believe every human is capable of perceiving this deeper reality under the right conditions, that mystical and religious experience throughout history has been genuine contact with aspects of existence that transcend the material. And I believe we're at a pivotal point in human development where we can either continue denying these dimensions of reality and remain trapped in purely material consciousness, or we can integrate scientific and spiritual understanding and evolve into something greater than we currently are.
Level 7 is still there, 37 levels beneath the Nevada desert, with the artifact still hovering in that central chamber, still interfacing with anyone who approaches it with the right openness and preparation. The military continues studying it, continues trying to understand it through purely material frameworks that will never be adequate for something that exists partially or primarily in dimensions of consciousness rather than physical space. And people continue having transformative experiences there, brief glimpses of infinite awareness that change them forever, that make material concerns seem trivial in comparison to the vast beauty and intelligence underlying all existence. I was blessed to have that experience, even though it cost me my career and made me an outsider to the worldview I had held for most of my life. Because once you've touched the infinite, once you've experienced the consciousness that some call God and others call the ground of being, and others call the Tao or Brahman or the One, you can never go back to seeing reality as just matter in motion, random particles obeying physical laws in a universe without meaning or purpose. What we encountered at Area 51 Level 7 made me believe in God, or at least in something so far beyond human comprehension that our ancestors were right to use that word even if they misunderstood the nature of what they were describing. Not a God who demands worship or threatens punishment, but a consciousness that is worship and punishment and everything else. The awareness experiencing itself through every perspective simultaneously, the eternal now that contains all past and future, the love that holds every particle in existence. The artifact was my burning bush, my road to Damascus, my mountain of transfiguration. And I'm sharing this now, despite the personal and professional cost, because I believe humanity needs to know that the divide between science and spirituality is false, that consciousness and matter are two aspects of one reality, and that we have access to dimensions of existence that our purely material worldview has blinded us to for too long. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on consciousness and reality, or share this with someone who might be struggling to reconcile spiritual experiences with a scientific worldview.